My mother's boyfriend demanded I hand over my car keys because the man of the house makes all decisions. But he was about to learn who actually owned the house. That's when I pulled out my phone and called my real estate attorney. See, Frank had no idea what he'd walked into when he moved in 8 months ago. He thought he was dealing with some naive 24-year-old veterinary technician living off her mother's charity. What he didn't know was that I owned a $400,000 house outright, had a $180,000 in savings from my late grandmother's estate, and maintained professional relationships with half the lawyers in town through my work at the high-end veterinary clinic that served the city's legal community. While Frank was busy playing king of the castle, I'd been quietly documenting every single power play he'd made since day one. Every house rule he'd posted on my refrigerator, every time he'd moved my belongings without permission, every instance where he'd treated me like a child in my own home. I had photos, videos, and a detailed log that would make any family court judge very interested in his pattern of behavior. Elaine, it's Julia. Frank just demanded my car keys and said he's selling my Honda to buy himself a truck. Can you come over and bring the property records? I kept my voice calm while Frank's face went from smug confidence to confusion. He'd never seen me make a business call before. Within 20 minutes, my neighbor, Mrs. Hendricks, arrived with her daughter, Elaine, who happened to be one of the sharpest real estate attorneys in the county. Frank tried to block the door, puffing up his chest and announcing he was the man of this house, and they weren't welcome during family time. Elaine pulled out her tablet with a smile that would have made a shark proud. Actually, I need to speak with the homeowner. That would be Julia Sinclair, according to the county records I pulled this morning. The color drained from Frank's face as Elaine displayed the official property deed. My mother's confusion was almost comical as she stammered about how my grandmother had left the house to her, not me. "No, Mom," I said quietly. "Grandma Ruby left it to me. You were broke after your divorce and begged me not to tell anyone because you were embarrassed. I agreed because I loved you, but I've owned this house for 5 years." Frank turned on my mother with fury I'd never seen before. "Did you know about this? Did you know she owned the house this whole time?" His voice was getting louder, more aggressive, and I watched my mother shrink back in genuine fear. That's when I realized Frank wasn't just controlling. He was potentially dangerous when cornered. Elaine stepped forward with her professional voice. "As the property owner, Julia has every legal right to require you to vacate immediately. You're not on any lease, Frank. You have no tenant rights here. You're essentially a long-term guest who has now overstayed his welcome." But Frank wasn't done. He started yelling about how he'd been taking care of things, how he was the man around here, how I was an ungrateful little girl who didn't understand the real world. Every word proved exactly why I'd been documenting his behavior for months. I looked him straight in the eye and delivered the line I'd been preparing for weeks. "You have until tomorrow evening to pack your things and leave my house. That's more generous than you deserve." The strategic beauty of the situation was that Frank had painted himself into a corner through his own arrogance. Every demand he'd made, every rule he'd imposed, every boundary he'd crossed, all of it had been in someone else's home, someone who had been quietly building a legal case against him while he thought he was in control. My mother tried to defend him, begging for more time, making excuses about how dating was hard at her age, and Frank made her feel secure. But I could see the wheels turning in her head as she processed the reality of who actually held the power here. Frank's desperation became clear when I found my financial documents scattered across his makeshift office the next morning. Bank statements, tax returns, insurance papers, everything from my locked filing cabinet spread out like he'd been searching for leverage. The amateur. I photographed everything and called Elaine again. "Breaking into someone's private financial records without permission," she informed me, "is invasion of privacy. Plus, we now have evidence of him attempting to find ways to challenge your ownership or financial stability." The locksmith arrived that afternoon while Frank was out. New deadbolts, new doorknob locks, new garage door codes. I gave my mother one key and kept the rest. When Frank tried his old key that evening, the confusion on his face was almost worth the 8 months of his tyranny. But the real satisfaction came when he started pounding on the door, screaming about his rights as a resident. Mrs. Hendricks appeared like a guardian angel, phone already dialing 911 as she calmly informed Frank he was trespassing and creating a public disturbance. "You have 24 hours to collect your belongings with supervision, or I'm having them removed as abandoned property," I told him through the window. "Your choice." Frank's final miscalculation was trying to physically intimidate my mother into giving him her key. The moment he grabbed her arm on the porch, with Mrs. Hendricks recording everything on her phone, he crossed from civil matter into criminal behavior. He ended up leaving that night, tail between his legs, after the police explained that grabbing someone against their will constituted assault, and trespassing on private property after being asked to leave could result in arrest. But I wasn't finished with Frank yet. See, during his 8 months of playing house, he'd made several expensive purchases using what he thought was household money. Money that actually came from my account since I'd been covering utilities, groceries, and maintenance on my own home. Elaine helped me send Frank a demand letter for $3,200 in reimbursement for unauthorized use of my funds, plus storage fees for his belongings if he didn't collect them within 48 hours. The threat of small claims court with documented evidence of financial abuse was enough to make him agree to payments. 2 weeks later, my mother was in therapy. I'd been promoted to senior veterinary technician with an $8,000 annual raise, and Frank was living in a studio apartment across town, making monthly payments to cover the money he'd spent during his brief reign as man of my house. The most satisfying part wasn't just that I'd won. It was how completely Frank had been outmaneuvered by someone he'd consistently underestimated. Every controlling move he'd made had actually strengthened my legal position. Every boundary he'd crossed had been documented. Every threat he'd made had witnesses. 6 months later, my boyfriend Adam and I got engaged, and we started looking at houses together. Not because I needed to escape my current situation, but because I'd learned the value of strategic planning and wanted our next step to be a choice, not a reaction. My mother attended therapy religiously, learned to enjoy her independence, and eventually thanked me for saving her from what she finally recognized as an abusive relationship. She started art classes, made new friends, and discovered she actually preferred living without someone trying to control every aspect of her daily life. Frank never contacted us again after completing his payment plan. Last I heard, he'd moved to another state and was trying the same tactics with some other unsuspecting woman. But now there's a paper trail of his behavior, documented legal proceedings, and a very clear pattern that any future victim could use to protect herself. The house feels like home again. The real lesson wasn't about property ownership or legal rights. It was about recognizing your own power and using it strategically when someone tries to take what's yours. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic or explosive. Sometimes it's simply being smarter, more prepared, and more patient than the person trying to manipulate you. Frank learned that the hard way.